Good morning, everyone in political science and U.S. government. I thought I had put up a video already concerning Chapter 10, which is interest groups and lobbying, but I was just going through the Blackboard section and I see that I haven't. It's an important chapter, but I think that the book itself does a really nice job. So my review is going to be a bit shorter. Hopefully, some of you will like that. I know I like shorter videos when I get a reference or a link to a video, and whenever I see anything over 10 minutes, I get horrified. So I'm going to keep it hopefully under 20. Okay, that's the best I can do because I talk, 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 talk. But a lot of people have this conception, including myself, that interest groups and lobbying somehow create immorality or what I consider sometimes kind of motivation uh, to corruption, and that's troublesome to almost everybody. It's troublesome to me, but at the same time, I have to be objective, and I have to say, do interest groups and lobbying actually have a beneficial role for society? And like a lot of things that we deal with in government, it is a double-edged sword. And so let's go through it. I guess we should talk about what our interest groups. Many of you are probably involved in some way as an interest group, whether you're active or what we call as a freeloader. I hate that term freeloader, but there are the book calls it free riders. I call it freeloaders. Sometimes we have an interest in something in our lives. I'm a teacher, for example. I teach at a community college system, so I'm a member of the Massachusetts Council for Community Colleges. I'm a union member. Does our union have certain interest in helping our membership and our goals and outlook for basically being, love to think objectively, it's about being better professors, but it's about basically benefits and pay and job security and all that stuff? Is that a private interest? That's a private interest, but is it nonetheless a type of interest that develops group orientation? Sure. And that's just it. It's the cry of one person in the woods often gets unheard, but the shouts of many together often get results. And that's the bottom line. And that's why public and private interest groups have developed over time. What's the difference between private and public? Public interest groups are those kinds of interest groups that come together to serve the public good in some way. Environmental groups that want to further and improve education in our public school system, want to maybe save endangered animal species. I can't think of them all off the top of my head. Private interest groups are just that. We may be involved in some industry. Maybe I'm a dairy farmer and I want to work with other dairy farmers to help get maybe government subsidies or tax breaks or other rules and regulations in the area of the dairy industry that make my ability to earn a living a little bit easier, predictable, and reflective of the needs of the dairy industry. I don't want laws that are injurious to us. I always think of fishermen, not that I'm a fisherman, but I always love the ocean, and I love seafood, and I've just been interested in the fishing industry very much. And there are many times regulations come up all the time about the limits in which commercial fishermen can catch in terms of cod and haddock right here in Massachusetts. The federal government often puts limits on that. Why? Because they put limits on it because there's a concern that these fish species are going to be overfished to the point of extinction, and they therefore want to put curbs on how many tons of fish can be caught annually and what the licensing fee would be, who can actually fish for them, all that kind of stuff. Now, if I'm a fisherman and I'm struggling, don't you think I want to get together with other fishermen and lobby the government to create rules that are not only logical, but also beneficial to my business interests? Yeah, it's only common sense. We all do it on some levels. And so but what's the negative of interest groups then? Well, public interest groups, there's very little negativity to. Public interest groups are wonderful. They're advocating things from the government to serve the welfare of the country. But at some point, what some people see as a public interest might be detrimental to what I see as what's in the best interest of the country, because we live in a pluralist society. Many of us who think we're doing something good for society might have other people on the opposite end of the political spectrum think what you're doing is actually detrimental to the welfare of the country. So be careful about calling something a public interest and thinking it's all perfectly wholesome and righteous at all times, because sometimes an interest group, even though it's public, trying to create a better public outcome might actually be deemed detrimental in other people's eyes. But private interest groups are big. I think of the other one I live not too far from a gun range down here, and I shoot myself sometimes. I haven't done it in a while. My oldest son is shooting now, and I keep every time we just went up because the gun range, there's one not too far from me. My son doesn't live with me, but he doesn't live too far away. And I said, hey, why don't you join the gun range way up here? Well, I just moved here less than a year ago. I said, let's go up there. And I see all these guys with their NRA hats and stuff. And my son says, should I join the NRA? Of course, I immediately turned into the teacher and I said, well, the NRA is a private interest group. It's promoting the interest of gun owners in the United States and maybe even beyond the United States. I don't know. I haven't been a member of the NRA for quite some time, but I have been in the past. And NRA is an example of an interest group that lobbies. What is lobbying? They try to get not only public opinion on their side, so there's that sort of component of a lobbyist interest group that's just trying to sway public opinion, because if public opinion goes a certain way, what do we know politicians do? They're seeing how the wind blows on certain issues, and if public opinion is very strong in one issue, politicians usually have to be responsive to it or they're going to lose their elective seat. But they're also direct lobbying. So that's one called indirect lobbying, where you basically try to create public opinion in your favor. The other is direct lobbying. You literally go and contact politicians that are in office or might get elected to office, candidates, and try to sway them to support certain legislative stances with regard to your interest, whatever it is. And some of you in this class might be very much concerned about keeping the right to bear arms very broadly interpreted. Others are saying, well, we need gun control. So there's two different tensions going on. And there are groups, and I can't remember the names off the top of my head, that are for certain kinds of limitations on the possession and ownership of guns, basically gun control advocates, and they create an interest group. And some would argue they're a public interest group. Some people would say the NRA is a public interest group. So you can see kind of a gradient scale, whether it's public interest or private. I'd make a very strong argument that the NRA is a private interest group. One that's a little less controversial, and NRA is considered one of the most powerful lobbying groups in this country. But one that's, I think, even more powerful is something called AARP. And it's I wish I could remember the acronym, but basically it's an advocacy group for seniors. And the seniors is a very low threshold, because I just received fairly recently an application to join AARP. You just have to be 50 or over, and I'm over 50, and I'm a member of the AARP, which is very depressing, but they are extremely powerful. They have a lot of money, because when you join AARP, they solicit funds from their membership, and their membership does what? They often come forward with money, and they have so many people, because there's a lot of people that are 50 and older in this country that want to preserve things like their Social Security retirement benefits, their access to Medicare, maybe nursing home. I don't know what all these things that us old people want to do, but there's a lot of us, and we often join. I haven't joined AARP, mostly out of embarrassment to be that old, but people that do, and if you follow politics, if you want to think of an interest group that does a lot of heavy lobbying and is very successful, it's AARP, one of the strongest. Some people argue it's a public interest group. It's not, because it's not trying to do everything for the benefit of all the public. They're really trying to focus on swaying public opinion and swaying politicians for the benefit of things that seniors think are in their best interest. Now, why is it a double-edged sword? Well, it seems like, well, geez, shouldn't we all, remember Washington when he was leaving this is not really a history class, but I think we touched on a little bit previously. Washington was really upset about political parties. We didn't want, is what James Madison called, factions. We didn't want different, but we're a pluralist society. We're always going to have factions that have different interests. Poor people, rich people, people of certain views about the environment, about unionism, about not unionism, all kinds of different interests develop, and we know we really can't, unless we're very, very wealthy and powerful in our own right, we have to team up with other people with like goals, and that's why interest groups naturally develop. And there was a recognition by Madison, not only he hated it, and so did George Washington, that we knew it was going to happen. So it sounds all negative, because it's all about what? It's all about selfishness, right? You're just advocating for your position, that the things that you're into. And it's fundamentally unfair not to do what everything's best for the most, right? Sort of a democratization of the process. Because we know those who are the most wealthy and the most organized and cohesive are probably going to be more successful in pushing the government in one direction or another. And that sounds very selfish. And that's why if you ever hear somebody say about it different, say I'm running against somebody else, and I can actually say with a straight face, because it's true, that my opponent often works with special interests. And if you vote for me, I'll only represent the people of my district. I will not cater to special interests, nor will I take their donations. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Because it sounds like I'm not going to be about supporting selfish entities' goals. But the reality is these groups, the special interest groups, whether the public or private, actually do a lot of good for the country too. How? Well, think about it. What if I'm um, um, from the airplane industry? We're going to advocate that certain legislation or regulations go before the FAA. Don't you think there might be a certain degree of expertise and knowledge about how a potential rule or a law might impact that industry either positively or adversely, just simply because we have a lot of expertise? And our self-interest is actually a way for us to communicate with the government to say, like, I want to inform you of what would be smart or ridiculous legislation in this area. So they are a great conduit through which information's passed. But it's kind of like telling, me asking, all right, hey, Mr. Fox, I want you to tell me the best way to protect the chickens in the chicken coop is the, flip side of that coin. But on the other side of the coin is if I'm running an industry and the government's about to pass rules or regulations related to that, wouldn't I be a great source of information to tell the government, if you do this, there's going to be huge ramifications for us in a negative fashion, or if you shape it this way, it might make the most sense for the public good. And you can look at me and say, I really want to study that question, but it's still not an invaluable. So you still should look at this source of information as being very, very important to our government. In fact, there often are hearings held in Congress, and guess who they invite? They invite lobbyists. Now, obviously, lobbyists are trying to, how do they sway the government? Well, one is they do it indirectly by creating public opinion to flow in a certain way so politicians respond. The other, and this is the part I think that bothers most people, is they wine and dine politicians. They literally go and call them. They take them out to dinner. Now, there has to be a lot of disclosure if they're going to try to give any money to the candidate for any reason other than campaigns. But can they donate to their campaign organization? Yeah. And can they donate what we call soft money to the agenda that's most likely going to help that candidate get either elected or reelected? Absolutely. And there's a famous case, I'm going to have to test you on it. It's the case dealing with Hillary Clinton. It was, I always forget the name of it. It was an election. There was a limitation on how much money interest groups could spend for political campaigning. Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. And the Supreme Court said, entities like unions and companies and organizations have free speech rights, and they should be able to spend their money any way they want. They have limits on how much they can give directly to a candidate, but can they promote concepts that identify with that candidate's positions? Yeah, they can, and it's unlimited. And a lot of people think that's the disgusting part of politics, that money really controls. So think about it. If I'm running for office and I have a very tough campaign ahead of me because my opponent's going to be is very competent and skilled and has a lot of popularity too, I really need as many advantages as I can get. And one of them is money, and money talks. Think about it. If I have some lobbyists that have really given me and raised through other entities a lot of financial support for me, and they call me and want to talk about a potential law that's coming before me or want a law passed, am I going to talk to them sooner than I'm going to talk to basically Joe Smith, some unknown person that's within my community? I'd like to think I wouldn't favor one or the other, but John McCain and Feingold, who passed the Feingold-McCain law, which got overturned by the United States Supreme Court, were trying to do away with that kind of money interest in politics. I don't think it's ever going to go away, and it's huge. So that's part of the double-edged sword. These lobbyists can really influence politicians, and that seems fundamentally unfair, because if they're powerful and wealthy and are supported by a group of wealthy people, arguably there's the precept that they own the politicians, they own the government. Whose pocket are you in is often the phrase you hear. Some of the things the government's done to help protect, well, one was the limitations on spending. You can't do that now because of the free speech. Directly you can, but not indirectly. But the other thing you do is lobbyists have to register, both on the state level, state of Massachusetts. You have to register as a lobbyist if you're going to do anything about Beacon Hill, talk to legislators and promote something about legislation or changing of legislation. You have to register. So everyone in the public knows who you are. And so if they see me and say I'm a state rep or state senator here in Massachusetts, and I'm talking to, Joe Smith, and Joe Smith is a registered lobbyist, people can at least raise that issue that, Corman's been hanging around with this lobbyist and he spends time at the lobbyist summer place on Martha's Vineyard. and issues of ethical failings could be brought forward. The other is the revolving door issue. Who becomes lobbyists in our country? People who can influence legislation. And it's often former legislators, former congressmen, former state reps, former state senators. They often join different organizations for the purposes of being hired to go and help shape and influence legislation that's pending. The one law that's still been held as constitutional is members of the House of Representatives, Congress. When they leave the Congress, they can't go do lobbying for 1 year. That big a deal. They get paid huge amounts of money. In fact, they get much more as a lobbyist than they'll ever get as a member of Congress. And that's I always used to wonder when I was younger, why did so and so leave the House of Representatives? I thought retire earlier or go to a different career. Same with senators. It's because they can make 10 times the amount of money being a lobbyist, basically lobbying their old friends in the Congress to go with certain legislation based upon the company or the organization that's hired them. Sometimes they're called think tanks. They're really not think tanks. They're what? They're lobbyist groups to lobby for someone's interest. Matter of fact, there's a lot of law firms now. That's all they do. Are lobbyist law firms. They're trying to influence government to go in a certain direction, and that usually makes most of us, including me, a bit sick. So the House of Representatives, there's a 1 year limitation on the revolving door, leaving Congress and going back to influence Congress as a lobbyist. And in the Senate, there's a 2 year limitation. To me, these are very minor considering the huge amounts of pay. I know when like the MGM casino was coming in Springfield, a lot of people were concerned that it seemed like the city councilor overnight, they had a lot of questions initially. Then several of them seemed to kind of turn their position in favor of the thing. And one of the other members said, I want a prohibition against any city councilor sitting now that votes in favor of allowing MGM to come in the city of Springfield to be barred from working for MGM for, I think it was 5 years after leaving, whatever it was. And it passed. And I really applauded that part of it because we don't want people being so heavily influenced with promises of jobs and high paying money in government so that legislation and or beneficial stances will be taken by government. But it sickens me because I have to admit, if I ever want to get involved in politics, what am I going to have to do? Well, one is I have to get elected, so I'm going to raise a lot of money, and these different lobbyists will probably donate to my campaign. And it's hard when someone donates to your campaign not to be responsive to at least discussing things with them. I'd like to think I'd have the courage not to promote legislation I don't think is in the public good. But what if I don't know? And all I'm hearing is one side, the loud voice of the lobbyist, and other people aren't speaking up in the public arena. So I don't really know of any negative aspect of legislation. Chances are the lobbyists are going to win the day. And it disgusts most people. And there's a nice article in the book, or a discussion book, of a guy by the name of Jack Abrahoff that worked all the way through, even starting in college, he started doing this. He worked for Ronald Reagan. But he went up, he became a lobbyist, and he committed a lot of crimes as a lobbyist, bribery. And it's really akin to it. They basically were trying to manipulate certain legislation illegally and not doing it by registering what your activities were with regard to lobbying politicians. And just like if I'm a politician, I shouldn't take what? Personal gifts to me. It's one thing to donate to my campaign or to promote my political stance in office. It's another to, set me up with a nice month-long vacation on the beaches of Martha's Vineyard. That would be troublesome because it's really a bribe. And that's the kind of thing that comes up, I think, a lot in this realm of private interest groups that are trying to shape legislation and doing lobbying. But they also serve a very important purpose. What's that purpose again? Information from the industry by which basically politicians are going to be advocating one way or another. And we know we want group participations. We want people to have an interest in stuff to join these groups so they can have a louder say or a more likely advocacy position when you're involved with a group. Voice standing alone is often seldom heard, but voices together can move mountains. Now look at all the different lobbying firms are here in the book. Total lobbying annual income. Wow, they make a ton of money, don't they? I know a lot of military people, not lower ranking, but if you're a former general or a full colonel or something like that in the military, and you were involved in some of the Pentagon contracting, after you leave the military, you often work for one of these military contracting companies like Raytheon or these other groups. You think you're really going there to, as an engineer, you're not an engineer, you're not going to be just developing missiles or things like that, but you're going to go and lobby the Pentagon to buy the products of Raytheon. You're going to say, hey, I'm a former general. I know what the military needs. They need this new rocket or this new defense system, and it's really the way to go. You can see the advantage of having somebody like that working for your company. They're really a lobbyist. influencing governmental policy, influencing elections. That's a big one too, because if you got a person in there that's like-minded, it'll certainly help quite a bit. And lobbyists, negativity about lobbyists has been around for a long time. They have a picture of a guy with just money bags as a brain. It says Harper Weekly, a Boss Tweed. That was a very famous, basically the Tweed control of government was a very sad part in American history, but it's recurring, I believe. Yeah, there's a picture here of Jack Abraham in Senator. He was just a young guy, really moved up the ranks, and ultimately did federal jail time for violating some of the criminal components, because it is a crime to bribe and to influence. And there's an old saying here in Massachusetts. Barney Frank, retired member of the House of Representatives, says, "What's the difference between a bribe and a political contribution?" Timing. Isn't there some truth in that? What's the difference between someone donating to me overtly and doing, other than giving me money on some level? I mean, yeah, there is a difference, but boy, it's on its face, I don't see it as so significantly different that we can't come away with a really sour taste in our mouths that maybe government's too influenced by moneyed interest. And regulating, we're probably going to do more regulations on these public interest groups and private interest groups, especially private interest groups. But I can tell you, they're here to stay because they do serve a very important purpose. I'm thinking right now, say if I'm a Massachusetts a congressman and I'm put on the National Fisheries Commission or something like that, or committee, and we're going to take up putting limits on how much haddock or cod is going to be able to be fished and under what season. I'm not a scientist. I don't know that much about fishing. So who do I want to come talk to me? I want the fishing industry to come talk to me. And do you believe they have very skilled lobbyists and attorneys and public speakers and presenters of information that are going to slant the information in a certain way so I can understand what their position is? Sure, but I'm still going to hopefully have enough sense to know that's their position, and I know they're arguing from their self-interest point. But then I can hear from whom? The environmentalists, maybe some scientists that work for the government, or scientists that work for Woods Hole, the Oceanographic Institute, that are more objective and are not interested about the money, actually interested about continuing the fish species. And hopefully between hearing all of that information, I can come up with wise legislation that'll work the best for all of us down the road. So don't think of it all as negative. Some of it is actually very meaningful. And I have a couple friends that are lobbyists. I think they're very moral people, but they're taking a position, and the position is what? They're presenting information in the light most favorable to their client's position. They're not there to be an objective. That's what the politicians hope for. They'll be the ones that object. Just like being a judge. If I'm a judge in a courtroom, the prosecution is going to present me evidence in the light most favorable to a guilty verdict, and the defense is going to present evidence that's in the light most favorable to an acquittal. And I hopefully, as a good a sayer of facts as a politician, would do what? Recognize the interests that are at stake and come out with hopefully a wise judgment. The problem is we don't have enough interest groups that are equally weighted in our governmental system, and those with the money are the ones that probably are the ones that are going to be heard. And I hate to sound a bit negative, but there's some truth to that. And hopefully our politicians do what? They have the courage to seek out the truth to the best that they can and take private interest lobbying with a grain of salt, with a certain degree of skepticism, and they explore it further. And that's what the government's job is to explore and seek out the truth before they make decisions. It's a shorter video. I thought I was going to try to make it shorter, and came out a little shorter. So, and we're going to get some real meaty stuff. Chapter 11 is Congress. I believe chapter 12 will be either the presidency or the courts. Yeah, it's the presidency's 12, so 13's got to be the courts. Yeah, the courts. And that's when we're going to put a lot of stuff on the final, so we're going to really dig in there and get a lot deeper. Be well.